Hello and welcome to our Sustainable Remediation Forum September webinar, where we're so pleased that you were able to join us today to hear Jacob Barnes and Brian Hoy from Burns and McDonnell speak about environmental justice considerations for remediation of contaminated sites. If you want to jump to the next slide for me, many of you are likely familiar with SURF, but if you're not, at SURF, we in a world that is healthy and resilient and is improved by remediating our degraded environmental conditions through sustainable practices. And as volunteers, we're working to advance the practice, to share our knowledge and share our successes, and provide education and outreach. We're always accepting new members, we're always accepting new sponsors, but I'm also really glad to have any of you that are neither of those today, because we really want to reach as many people as possible. If you're not super familiar with SURF and you want to learn more or maybe find resources pertaining to sustainable or resilient remediation, I really encourage you to check out our website. Check out our social networks. We're on both LinkedIn and Twitter, as well as joining our email listserv. And so, you're not here to see me, you're here to see our presenters. So without further ado, I want to introduce our two speakers today. The first, Brian Hoy, is a remediation section manager at Burns and McDonnell. He's based out of Kansas City, Missouri. And in this role, he leads teams of scientists and engineers assisting clients in the investigation and the remediation of legacy contamination across various industrial, manufacturing, and federal facilities. And then our second speaker, Jacob Barnes, also of Burns and McDonnell, holds a BS in chemical engineering, is professionally licensed environmental engineer with over 18 years of experience, with experience in heavy metals, PAHs, pesticides, perchlorate, chlorinated solvents, and petroleum, and has experience with in situ and ex situ remediation. So you're in great hands. And so with that, we can continue on to the start of their slide deck and get Brian and Jacob up here. Thanks y'all so much.
Thank you very much, Betsy. Jacob Barnes here. I'm going to go ahead and discuss, Brian and I are going to discuss environmental justice considerations for remediation of 4 contaminated sites. Next slide, please. I'm going to provide a definition of environmental justice and go over notable events in the environmental justice timeline. Then I'll turn it over to Brian so he can discuss the community impact assessment process and community engagement. Then I'll discuss confidential site number 1 and EJ considerations for this site. This is a remedy implementation example. And then I'll discuss confidential sites 2 through 4, EJ considerations for these sites that are currently in the remedy selection process. So those are remedy selection examples. And I'll go over our brief conclusion. Next slide, please. If you visit EPA's environmental justice website, you'll find environmental justice, or EJ, defined as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people regardless of race, color, national origin, or income with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. This goal will be achieved when everyone enjoys the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards and equal access to the decision-making process to have a healthy environment in which to live, learn, and work. Next. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 plays a big part in the basis of EJ, but even before discussing that, I want to mention the Memphis sanitation strike of 1968 and the Warren County PCB landfill 1982. The Memphis, Tennessee sanitation strike was an action taken against unfair treatment and environmental justice concerns and was investigated by the civil rights leader, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It was the first time African Americans mobilized a national broad-based group to oppose environmental injustices. The second time African Americans mobilized a national broad-based group was a nonviolent sit-in protest against a PCB landfill in Warren County, North Carolina. Over 500 activists were arrested and the protest was unsuccessful in halting construction. This event is widely understood to be the catalyst for the environmental justice movement. Then in February of 1994, President Bill Clinton signed Executive Order 12898, Federal Actions to Address Environmental Justice in Minority Populations and Low-Income Populations. And along with the executive order was an accompanying memo that linked the executive order to Title VI of the Civil Rights Act 1964. And I'm paraphrasing the language here, but essentially what the memo, portion of the memo indicated that it essentially indicates that discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin shall not enter into human health or environmental programs receiving federal financial assistance. And governmental agencies have been hard at work at EJ since that executive order. The Federal Interagency Working Group on Environmental Justice, EJIWG, held their first public meeting in 1995, and they've been working on EJ ever since. The National Environmental Justice Advisory Council issued a report on gentrification and displacement in 2006. The General Services Administration, the GSA, signed a memorandum of understanding on environmental justice and the executive order. They signed it in 2011, and the Office of Environmental Justice prepared a treaty for the review of federal environmental law and policy for tribes and indigenous peoples. These two events occurred in 2001, 2014 respectively, and the EPA has been the most prolific in terms of issuing both internal and external environmental justice documents. These include guidance documents, memorandums, and trainings regarding environmental justice and now its relationship to NEPA, risk assessment, permitting, and other topics. EPA also issued its EJSCREEN tool in 2015. The latest document I'm aware of coming from EPA regarding EJ is a memo from July of this year, strengthening environmental justice through cleanup enforcement actions. And with that, I want to turn it over to Brian Hoy so he can discuss environmental justice and remediation projects.
Yeah, thank you, Jacob. So, as Jacob mentioned, the focus of environmental justice really is to make sure that the projects that we're implementing, whether they be a remediation project or not, are not having a disproportionate impact or effect on a disadvantaged community. And one of the things that's really important to keep in your mind as a remediation practitioner is that in general, our projects are programmed and designed to clean up or improve the environment and really are in great alignment with the objectives of EJ in improving the quality of life and the situation at a certain site or certain area. We of course approach the projects with the mindset of first do no harm. We're trying to improve the conditions, not exacerbate anything. But we need to keep in mind that in certain areas and on certain projects, there are demographics that are disproportionately exposed to environmental impacts, just given the proximity to a site, and maybe it's an older part of town or closer to industry where people work, etc. So as a result, the remedies that we implement could have the potential to disproportionately impact those communities in the short term. So one of the things that we're going to focus on is both how do we make sure that we're managing that and making decisions that are mindful of that, but don't lose sight of the fact that when it comes to remedy selection, there's some considerations there as well. Something else that's of note is that the different communities that are out in the country will be affected in different ways. What's important in one area is not going to be transferable to another, depending on who's present or what features might be at play. So it's important that we define those EJ objectives up front at the start of a project and metrics that are going to be used to measure success, as the requirements that are out there don't have a clear line as to when you've achieved environmental justice. Next slide. So as far as the, one of the questions that we usually get right off the bat is, does EJ apply to this project or this effort? And the way that we do that is to first implement a data collection process where we're upfront defining our project area, and that will generally have a primary area, which would be the site, and the adjacent, adjacent either properties or parcels, as well as the secondary area. And this could be other areas that might be affected by the activities that are going to get implemented as part of a project. So think travel corridors, lay down yards, etc. We then try to pull together information on the different demographics that characterize those two areas, and that's largely based on census data, but there are other ways to get a handle on this as well if needed. And these are the types of things that we'll look at. So we'll try to measure what is the ethnicity of the area, what's the race makeup, is there a gender trend either towards people that are below 5 years of age or over 65? Do we have disabled individuals? What's the median income? Are we at or below the poverty level? And what percentage of the people living there are below the poverty level? Is there language or are there any linguistics challenges, whether it's English proficiency, it's limited, or maybe an area that's linguistically isolated? We'll want to know that. Access to internet, and then on instances, looking at trends in this data can be helpful as well. Next slide. So a really good resource to be able to get that data is through the EJSCREEN tool that Jacob referenced. It's a online dashboard web browser that actually has an interactive map that you can go and pull a lot of this data down from. It's based on census data, but in addition to that, it also provides these vulnerability and susceptibility indexes that Jacob will talk to a little bit later. But it's really a nice feature to be able to pull data, produce figures that show distribution of different demographics and help inform these decisions. So next slide. Next slide, sorry. All right, so once we have the data collected on the demographics, we'll then expand our search to also look at what sorts of facilities might be present in the area. This could be, public facilities, whether it's police, fire, EMS. But ultimately, we're looking for centers that other organizations could be operating out of. So think a community center that may have a specific group meeting there at any time. Those can be useful both to know who might be coming and going that's not assigned to the parcel itself, but also in an outreach effort and making use of those facilities to gain participation. We want to know if there's any cultural or historical resources that might be present and sensitive. We assess zoning, especially if a project might result in changing of zoning, or if we're using land use restrictions that might prevent the future use of a parcel for its current use. Is that going to affect where somebody might be able to live or the business that they operate? And then looking at other areas of environmental concern. So are we near a known and scarce drinking water resource? Do we have ecological resources or preservations that need to be protected? All that might trigger another concern in addition to the individual demographics. So the next slide. And once we have all of this, we can then start to predict and assess what the effects of the action might be. So keep in mind that there can either be a poor effect or a beneficial effect of a project. So we'll go through and look at all of those. But we'll really look at direct effects, and if in the context of remediation, these are effects that we might have on a community, specifically related to the actions on site and associated with that remediation effort. So, think potential to generate a vapor or an odor at the site that needs to be managed, or use of a right of way to support an injection transect where we're working within the plume, but we might be disrupting somebody. Then we have our indirect effects. So, increased construction through a school zone or waste passing by one of the sensitive areas that we talked about before might be an indirect effect that needs to be managed. And once we have all those on the table, we'll try to understand what is the overall cumulative effect of that remedy. It's largely beneficial, like we mentioned earlier, and in line with the objectives of EJ, since we're cleaning up the site. But we want to make sure that we're minimizing the short-term impacts to the extent practical. So some strategies on how to address those, first is avoid them. So if we can select a remedy that maybe doesn't include ex situ handling of soil that might provide a vapor concern, that would be, it's not always possible, but that would be preferential in some situations. We can minimize things like noise effects by limiting work hours, and then we can mitigate a lot of these effects through engineering controls like Jacob will talk about later in the presentation. So next slide. And then once all that's done, we run through a community engagement process. So the goal with respect to EJ for community engagement is to foster fair and meaningful participation of the community in making decisions related to that project. So for remediation, depending on the stage that you are in the project, that may look like either how are we going to implement a remedy, or it might even go further or earlier in the process to how are we selecting remedies, and Jacob will talk through that. But we implement these strategy plans early, or these outreach strategies early and often. So we want to make early and frequent contact with the community, and then implement that same process throughout the project so that there's access to information. It flows both ways, both updates on the project status, but also receiving input and concerns, documenting them, and being able to show that they're being accounted for. And one thing that's always of consideration, this is what sort of minority populations might we have to account for. So we want participation, and generally those populations want to participate, but there may be things that we need to be mindful of, such as apprehension to going to a government meeting. So if there's agencies there that could deter participation. So when we look at online platforms, the ability to remain not anonymous may promote participation. If we're dealing with linguistics as a barrier, make sure that we have the right folks serving as translators who are trusted in the community. And then there's always the opportunity to provide incentives, whether that's access to transportation, bus passes, et cetera, to help bring people to the event. So visually impaired and hearing impaired individuals can be something else to consider in that. But ultimately, once we go through this outreach effort, we can then report back to the team and see, are we meeting our proposed objectives, or what we thought was a reasonable objective at the beginning of the project, and then move forward. Next slide. So I will hand it back over to you, Jacob, to finish out the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Brian. I'm going to go over our first site, confidential site number 1, brief site description. It is a former industrial facility operated about 100 years ago. All the above ground structures associated with former operations have been removed, and the site is currently vacant. Next slide, please. Geology and hydrology at the site's very, typical of a lot of remediation projects that we work on. There's clay, silt, and sand overburden. Groundwater is located less than 20 feet below ground surface, relatively shallow. Bedrock is less than 100 feet below ground surface, and the site is surrounded by residential, commercial, and industrial properties. Remedial objectives include cleanup of groundwater to residential risk-based standards. Next slide, please. We ran an EJSCREEN report for the site, and the results are summarized on this slide. The results to the left, these are the demographic indicators. The chart, the bar graph to the right, these are the EJ indices. On the demographic indicators, what the results showed us was that the concentration of people of color nearby the site, we ran the report for a 1-mile ring centered at the site. That concentration is lower than the concentration of people of color in the state and the nation. People with the concentration of people with low income greater at the site than at the average for the nation and the state that the site is located in. The concentration of linguistically isolated people is low. It's lower than that for both the state and the nation. People with less than a high school education in the vicinity of the site is proportional to that for the nation, but greater than the state. Children less than 5 years of age, concentration of those children at the site, near the site, is proportional to that for the state, but greater than the nation. And folks greater than 64 years old at the site is greater than both the state and the nation. And the key indicator here are really the top two when we're looking at the people of color indicator and low income. Well, the low income here showing, that this is really, both of these things tie back to the language in the executive order. And we have our low income indicator really shows us, the applicability of EJ at this site. Now the EJ indices to the right of the slide, this provides a bit more detail about the community, and it provides detail in terms of percentiles for different, indices. Take, for example, the traffic proximity index that's kind of in the middle of the chart. You see 3 bars, a blue bar, green bar, and an orange bar. Take the orange bar, for example. That is the state percentile. So folks in close proximity to the site are in the 75th percentile for traffic proximity. And for the orange bar for the state, what that means is that amount is compared to the state. So what that means is 25%, only 25% of the population of the state have a higher degree of traffic proximity than the folks around our site. And similarly for EPA region, that's the green bar, the site folks are at about the 75th percentile. So we're looking at about, in the EPA region, 25% of the population within that region, only 25% of people within that region have a traffic or in closer proximity to traffic than the folks near the site. Next slide, please. Environmental impacts at the site consist of non-aqueous phase liquid. There are also soil concentrations, and there are dissolved phase groundwater impacts, primarily benzene. The primary risk at the site is down gradient migration of that dissolved phase benzene. And the selected remedy is an earthwork-based remedy. It's a combination of excavation and soil amendment. The soil amendment portion will allow for essentially sequestering the contamination in place. Next slide, please. These are our community outreach methods for this site. We started simply by running the EPA EJSCREEN tool to determine EJ applicability. We did some reconnaissance work, which included knocking on doors, going door to door, and asking about wells, trying to determine if any of the residences have wells on their property. And that's primarily for us to gather information. It's not necessarily to provide the community a lot of information about any activities at the site or upcoming activities at the site, but it puts a face to the site and kind of puts activity, any upcoming activity at the site on the community's radar, so to speak. And as Brian mentioned, we want early and frequent contact. We want to contact the community about upcoming activities months before they happen, not days before they happen. And there's several ways to do this, and we utilized all of these for site number 1. Social media, Facebook is one example, mailers and postcards going directly to each home, door hangers, placing information on the door hangers directly on their door handle. and also an article in the local newspaper. If this method is used, a complete article is not necessary. If a local newspaper is used, it could be as simple as 1 or 2 sentences providing a notification. And really the key part of our outreach here is the public presentation. Next slide, please. We found that having the public presentation as a virtual presentation was very beneficial, and there's several online platforms available for this, Teams and Zoom are a couple of examples. This increases access to the community for actually attending the presentation. Some folks may not be inclined to attend an in-person meeting. They may not have the time to transport themselves or be transported to an in-person meeting. So they can participate in the meeting or attend the meeting just using their phone or their computer at home. There are several helpful features of these platforms, including a typewritten question management feature. The community can submit their questions in writing. They can be managed, and the questions can be sent up to the speaker. This way you could avoid any potential disorganization that might occur during an in-person meeting. Also, there are recording and transcribing features available for these platforms. Teams, for example, can record the entire presentation or just transcribe in words what was said. So the community can view the presentation later on if they couldn't show up for the live presentation. The presenting team, obviously, this was us, the environmental consulting, doing most of the presenting. It's also important, if you can, to have the client, the responsible party, be part of that presentation team. This speaks to transparency, and this shows the community. That helps show the community that the RP is not trying to hide anything from the community. Also, a toxicity or health expert as part of the presentation team and helping develop the presentation, and also a public relations expert as part of the team and developing the presentation. It's incredibly key or very helpful to have these types of personnel on your team. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. Part of what was, oh, can you go back up or go up one, please? There we go. So in putting the presentation together, the most important thing is really to anticipate what the community's concerns are going to be. Children, where are the children playing, or do they normally play nearby the site? Is there a school nearby the site? Are they walking to and from school nearby the site? Health conditions, does anybody in the community have any pre-existing health conditions, asthma, for example? Traffic and access. The activities at the site could, potentially impede their, community commuting to and from work, or to and from wherever they are or wherever they're going or coming from. Odors and noise. What are the working hours? Some community members may work graveyard shift, and so they're day sleepers. So working during the day, other controls to control something like noise would be key. Also, contact information needs to be provided. What is the hotline number? What's the phone number if I call, if I have any questions, or if I detect what I think is a problem, I smell something that I believe is coming from the site, or I believe there's damage occurring close to my home because of what's going on at the site. Delivery of the presentation. We scheduled our presentation at a time when folks are most going to be available to attend, usually in the evening during a weeknight, Monday through Friday. Delivery of the presentation needs to be timely. You don't want to provide the presentation a year before field work. It will leave everybody's minds by the time we get to field work. And you don't want to do it just a couple days before, because that's not enough time, for this information to be processed and for the community to, communicate to us what their concerns might be. Transparency is key. Sharing the plan for the site, what we're going to do, what equipment is used, how is it used, the remediation equipment, as well as the monitoring equipment for monitoring things like air and dust. What you want to do, and what we have done, is communicate these things using familiar language. For example, instead of saying remediate, we're going to remediate the site using in situ methods, we're going to conduct a cleanup using methods that do the cleanup in place. Next slide, please. And here is some of the technical information that we share during the presentation. During remedy implementation, we're going to have monitoring and controls in place. Monitoring, air monitoring, odor monitoring, sound monitoring, and then controls, both engineering and administrative, to control, potential, EJ issues that we're monitoring for. On the engineering side, water for dust suppression, odor mitigating foam, non-PFAS odor mitigating foam, sound blankets to mitigate any sound coming from the site. Those sound blankets could also have an aesthetic effect. In terms of administrative controls, if the area is, if there's not a lot of real estate available for parking trucks and staging other equipment, is there an area a couple blocks away that would be away from the community where those things can be parked or staged temporarily? And limit working hours. We don't want to impede folks. Most folks are up during the day and they sleep at night, not all the time. But those are the types of things that we want to consider during working hours. Next slide, please. So that was an example of EJ considerations during remedy implementation. I'm going to briefly go over EJ considerations during the remedy selection process, starting with what's the appropriateness of remedial action objectives. Is the remedy protective? Equal treatment of communities. All communities should be treated equal. When selecting a remedy, populations of interest may increase the weight placed on certain balancing or modifying criteria. And the next bullet down is really specifically that criteria. It turns out to be community acceptance. Assessing community acceptance in consideration of demographics and community needs. Disruption to communities during remediation. This could include displacement of residences, businesses, and also potential for exposure. We also want to consider time frame to remedy effectiveness. Take, for example, M&A, monitored natural attenuation, versus active remediation. M&A is most likely going to take a longer time to reach remedial action objectives than active remediation, but that may be warranted given the EJ concerns. Next slide, please. So here's a brief description of the brief summary description of the 3 confidential sites. We call them sites 2, 3, and 4. Sites 2 and 3 are both former industrial facilities. Site 4 is an active industrial facility. Geology and hydrogeology of sites 2 and 3 are very similar. We have unconsolidated overburden material. Groundwater is located about 20 to 30 feet below ground surface, and bedrock is at about 100 feet below ground surface. Site 4, unconsolidated overburden material, but groundwater is shallower at less than 10 feet, and bedrock is shallower as well at less than 20 feet. The primary impacts at sites 2 and 3 are PAHs, metals, and benzene, so non-chlorinated. And but confidential site 4, it's primarily chlorinated VOCs. Right. And then the risk at all three sites is the same. It's a down gradient migration. And in fact, site number 4, down gradient migration has already occurred to the point where vapor intrusion is a risk, and vapor intrusion VI mitigation systems have already been installed in a number of homes in the affected community. The EJSCREEN rankings, or really the scores, the EJSCREEN scores were high on low income population for all three sites, and for site 4, it was high for people of color population as well. Prior public engagement and presentations have already occurred for site 4. This was largely surrounding installation of the VI mitigation systems. Next slide, please. So for these 3 sites, we are currently evaluating several remedial alternatives for each site, and and those remedial alternatives do depend on components. For example, confidential site number 2, we're looking at remedial alternatives that consider both a source area component and a down gradient component. We're not looking at an up gradient component. We don't see much value at this point in doing anything up gradient. At confidential site 3, we're looking at up gradient and down gradient, and not really considering the source area. Our accessibility to the source area right now is incredibly limited. And then at site 4 is the same as site 2, where we're considering remedial technology both in the source area and down gradient. And shown on the right in this table are how we're balancing and modifying criteria that we use to determine really the best remedial alternative. And when we incorporate EJ, the question becomes, well, what happens? How could incorporating EJ, affect our selection? And that really means we're putting additional weight onto the community acceptance criteria. And the next slide is an example of what could happen as a result of that. Thank you. So when we're talking about community acceptance, primarily we're talking about disruption to the community during implementation of the remedy. Take a look at confidential sites 3, for example. We originally did not have access to the source area, so we're only looking at up gradient and down gradient. However, down gradient, there's a higher concentration of residents in the down gradient area than there are in the up gradient area, so that may mean we limit the amount of work that we do down gradient, if we do any work at all. It could be as minimal as monitoring. As long as we can still reach remedial objectives, it may it'll affect some of these other things. It may affect the time to reach the objective, but it's still an alternative. Same thing for confidential site 4. The higher concentration of residents down gradient than near the source area, so we might have to pull back our approach or minimize our approach in the down gradient area. Now, confidential site number 2 is an interesting case. There was no change. We're still looking at source area and down gradient. Source area happens to be a higher concentration of residents near the source area than down gradient. If we're considering, if we want to continue looking at the source area while considering community acceptance during disruptions during implementation, then what that means is we need to start looking at implementability. Do we need to start adding additional engineering controls? Engineering are preferred, and also there's administrative controls as well. Do we need to start adding these things to our approach to the source area to make this work and still gain community acceptance? Next slide, please. In conclusion, so overall, remediation projects improve the site and make better communities. Remediation projects are consistent with EJ goals. Minimizing impact to the community from remedial activity is key, and there's no set benchmark for achieving EJ, so guidelines need to be established for each project. Data collection is needed to understand the populations, and outreach is needed to foster participation and should continue through remedy implementation. And so that's all I have. I'm going to turn it back over to Betsy.
Thanks, Jacob. I'll go ahead and work through some questions now. Just a reminder to folks, if you do have questions, go ahead and enter those into the questions panel, and we'll get those answered. First one that's come in so far. What documents are you memorializing your EJ assessments prior to the remedy decision document?
Yeah, so I can handle that one. It largely is going to depend on the program that you're working in, of course. But usually the main outreach that happens where the first set of decisions are going to be made is in your, whether it's a feasibility study or a CMS or corrective action study, and being able to memorialize it in that document is beneficial. But that's not the only time that you're going to be running through an outreach, or should be running through an outreach effort on a project where this is a consideration. So, again, leading up to construction, whether or not that's a formal requirement for a component of a document or not is going to be project specific, but those are the two places where we've seen it memorialized in the past. I'll add to that we've also seen EJ be recommended to be listed as a ARAR when running through an FS type evaluation. So generally that's where it gets prompted.
Okay, and like I said, it was a kind of a multi-part question there, but I covered some of it. But just to make sure, where you memorialize those actions once you've completed and performed them, and are you including this as a module of a CERCLA document or other documents?
We've not included as a module of a CERCLA document yet. So I'd say, we don't have, a data point for that, but in general, the types of documents that we would memorialize this are the ones we spoke to.
Okay, next one here. These do seem like really robust EJ activities at each of these sites. Who or what was the driver for this, or similarly, what would we expect to be the driver?
Yeah, so I think some of it is sensitivity of this project and the areas. We probably can't go into the specifics on all the decisions that heighten this. I think we're seeing, depending on the teams that we're working with, some organizations are more focused on these items than others. Certainly EPA's recent memos that Jacob referred to are heightening awareness related to EJ. So I think that it's ultimately in the consulting role, we want to identify that this is a consideration. Here's what could come into play, and we have rolled out a robust outreach program on these projects. It may not be necessary for every site given where it's located, and not everybody may feel that is warranted. So that's something that needs to be worked through on a case-by-case basis. But the value, I think, is kind of like a lot of things in our industry where we're trying to mitigate risk, whether that be to the project and to the organizations that we work with, and it could be in the I guess in the form of a claim that this wasn't followed.
guess that kind of leads into this next question. Do you have any suggestions on how we can convince our teams, either internal or external, of the value of EJ?
Yeah, well, I think that's a bit of a philosophical question. And, there's the legal component of it. I think that's one data point to point to. But, there's a general mindset as well, and a general, I think, core belief that this is important, and that that goes towards convincing teams as well. I think it's easier to influence an internal team than an external, but those are all things that can be pointed to help with this. And then if there are organizations that are worried about their image and being a good corporate citizen, I think that's something that can be pointed to as reason to do this.
Thanks. Are EJ actions evaluated? For example, do you perform evaluation surveys after the remedial actions?
We have not.
Are you using any sources for EJ data beyond the EPA EJSCREEN tool?
Yeah, we are. So a good example of that would be, the EJSCREEN tool gives you a good outline of demographics. So that's going to be based on census data, and it's largely tied to parcels and ownership and use. A good example where we're using other data sources would be if there's a community center at the near the facility, looking at who's operating out of that, what organizations are there. Is there a basketball league that's playing? Is there a Boy Scouts troop that operates out of there? Those are the kind of deeper dive that takes some legwork to figure out, but can be beneficial when it comes time to do that outreach.
So using one of the case studies as an example, or just more broadly too, was there something you did on a project specifically because of the EJ considerations that you don't feel you would have done otherwise?
Jacob, I don't know if you have anything to add to this, but I think largely the administrative type things where, maybe we look at work schedule, limiting it to normal working hours, not working weekends when we have a, specialty contractor coming in from another location that may rather work through the weekend. Those are the main things that we've applied. There may be some other things looking at, what's the timeline of the remedy for achieving remedial action objectives, and I guess what comes to mind, Jacob, is the applying down gradient treatment versus not, and does that, even though we're remediating a source area, does that help us get to the end goal faster? Might be something that we would apply.
Right, and as an example, down gradient, if we're in the affected neighborhood, are we going down there several times, couple times a year to do injections, for example, or are we going out there just a couple times a year to collect groundwater samples, or are we not going down there at all? If folks are entering the area on a routine basis, some type of outreach for the folks in the area may be appropriate. Otherwise, without any contact, they could be potentially seeing, who are these folks in PPE showing up routinely and with equipment routinely, but providing them information could alleviate any anxieties that they might have just by fact of not knowing what the reason is.
Do you guys have a general estimate on additional cost for EJ considerations?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, all of this, it takes time and effort. So there is an added cost. It's largely going to be based on, what level of outreach you want to go to. So, it's hard to give a straight, it costs this answer to that. But if whoever asked that question would like to reach out to me after the fact, I'd be happy to discuss specifics with them.
Are considerations being given to permanent solutions, technology that permanently cleans and recovers resources with zero emissions output?
I think that's, in looking at sustainable remedies, and if we can incorporate that into one of the remedies, and that helps speak to this, address the EJ concern, that's certainly on the table. Of course, we have to look at, is that compatible with the site? So in these cases, I would say, no, especially with respect to zero emissions output, but not to say it couldn't be.
What if the closest resident is just over 1 mile from the site? Would EJ apply?
Well, so there is no benchmark for EJ. Each site is different, so guidelines need to be developed for each individual site. And so to help answer that question, you have to take a look at multiple components of the project. Is there a risk of migrating, contaminated groundwater migrating down gradient into that neighborhood that's a mile away, into that area that's a mile away? Are there any concerns? Do you have any emissions associated with a stack that's part of a remediation system that needs to be considered? Are you going to be going down gradient for any reason? A mile down from the site to do anything, say, groundwater monitoring example again, or injections or something like that. Look at the individual components of the project to help answer that question.
Have you so far seen, a lot of hurdles to overcome, just implementation of some of this, like community members not having access to internet to attend a virtual presentation, or not being able to make, in-person presentations, et cetera? Kind of how do you handle that?
Yeah, I haven't heard too many, folks having that problem, but in the event, that internet access is limited to some folks, and they cannot attend the live presentation, I would say, if possible, if the presentation is recorded, then at some later date, try to seek out a public facility that may have computers and internet access, like a library or a community center, where the presentation can be, viewed at that point. If it's not recorded, if it's just transcribed, then you can obtain a copy of the transcription. And if the presentation, if it cannot be attended live and it cannot be seen for whatever reason after the fact, that's why we have, it's helpful to have multiple tools, multiple outreach tools, the mailers, postcards, news article, and also phone number. It's important to provide contact information so they can call in with their questions and receive information and get a response.
And I'd add to that quick that, any of these outreach efforts, you're never going to have 100% success on, like any, public survey that's administered. So, I think that's part of why it's a good idea to incorporate multiple communication techniques. So Jacob mentioned, door hangers and mailers and newspaper articles. And the more you can get out there, the higher your contact rate will be.
Yeah. So there seems to be a lot of parallels between EJ and the social aspect of sustainable remediation. Have you come across any major differences between them that are notable?
I think they're very well aligned. I don't know about notable differences. I think with the, with the EJA component, there is some, legal precedent and requirement associated with it. But overall, the concepts I think are very much aligned.
Okay, yeah, I think that that looks like about it, and about right on schedule to wrap up our questions as well. So with that, I'll be handing it over here to Betsy to kind of give us a quick outro, and then we did have one final question. I think Betsy can speak to this about email information for Brian and Jacob. I don't want to speak out of turn, but I think we can make sure we get that posted on our SURF website to make sure that that's available for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. If Brian and Jacob are okay with that, I bet also if we Google their names and Burns and McDonald, we'd probably be able to find them. Brian and Jacob, thank you so much for a really interesting presentation. We appreciate your time, and I think there was clearly a lot of interest. We had a lot of participants and a lot of really interesting questions. Thank you again to you for presenting, and then also to your company, Burns and McDonald, for serving as a SURF sponsor, which we greatly appreciate. If you're looking for more information about SURF, you can check out our website, sustainableremediation.org. We also have a YouTube channel. This video will be posted, so if you thought it was really interesting and they want to share it with others, that'll be up in just a couple of days, but also all of our past webinars are available. We've also just posted a bunch of how-to videos for the footprint analysis tools, Sitewise and SEPA. So if that's interesting to you, you might want to go look at those. If you want to make sure you're the first to know about future webinars, subscribe to our emails, and you can do that at the Sustainable Remediation website, or you can email me, what is my email? Probably president@sustainableremediation.org. If not, you can also Google me, Betsy Collins Jacobs, and you'll probably be able to hunt me down. In terms of upcoming conferences, AEHS East is going to be fully virtual. It's next month. It's not too late to sign up. There's going to be a panel on those sustainable remediation tools. We've got a session of platforms on sustainable remediation in action. We're also going to have a SURF meeting, and that's open to attendees of AEHS and non-attendees. You just have to register in advance. So if you're on our listserv, you would have gotten that information. You can register, but if you need more information, feel free to reach out. And then also, we're already looking forward to March 2022, March 14th to 17th, save the date. SURF, along with AEHS, is hosting SUSTREM 2022. So it's going to be, fingers crossed, in person, a ton of sustainability and resilience information. And then with our last 2 minutes, if you can flip to our last slide, just again, another huge thanks to our sponsor, whose support we wouldn't be able to do any of the work that we're doing. A special shout out to TriHydro. As always, TriHydro is hosting our webinars and providing us a lot of support to make sure that these go really smoothly, and we're so appreciative of that. And then another thank you to Burns and McDonald for providing our speakers today and providing such critical information about the work that they're doing in the environmental justice arena. And so with that, thank you so much. Good to see everyone, and yeah, reach out if you want to talk about SURF anytime. Thank you so much. Have a good day.